Welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going to try to answer a pretty big question about Canada's youth justice system. Is it fair? Is it balanced? We've got a really interesting mix of sources that you sent us. Textbooks, Sunsetti notes, and even some YouTube videos by, I think his name is Mr. Philiplick. So yeah, let's just dive in.
Having all these different kinds of sources is great because we can look at this from different perspectives, not just the legal side of things.
For sure. Okay, so to start off, I guess the core issue here is fairness, right?
Mm.
Mr. Philiplick, he starts off his video with this cartoon, and it's amazing. It shows all these animals lined up, and it's about to take a test. And the test is to climb a tree.
Oh yeah, classic example to show what's the difference between equality, like treating everybody the same, and equity. Like you said, making a fish climb a tree isn't really fair.
Right. Even if everybody has to take the same test. So that got me thinking. Does Canada's justice system just treat all young offenders the same? Like the same punishment for the same crime no matter what? Or does it try to be more equitable and consider each kid's background and circumstances? What do you think?
That's a great question. And it's one that the Youth Criminal Justice Act, also known as the YCJA, really digs into. Now, it's important to remember that this is different from the Criminal Code of Canada, which is for adults.
Okay, yeah, the YCJA is specifically for young offenders. So how is it different, though? Does it lean more toward equality or equity?
Well, one of the biggest goals of the YCJA is rehabilitation. Reintegration. It's built on this idea that young people, well, they're still developing, right? And they have a much better chance than adults do at actually changing their behavior. So the focus is on helping them learn from their mistakes and become, productive members of society.
So it leans more towards equity then. Because if you're trying to help kids turn their lives around, you kind of have to consider their individual situations, right?
Absolutely. And that's exactly why the YCGA has things like warnings, cautions, referrals to community programs. It's not just about sending them to court right away.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like giving a kid a second chance instead of just coming down hard on them right away.
Yeah.
Like for shoplifting or something, for the first time. What about if they do end up in court, though? Does it try to be equitable then, too?
It does. It really tries. Judges have to consider each young person's situation. Plus, it really emphasizes protecting their identities. The idea is that labeling them as criminals can make it even harder for them to move on from what happened.
Interesting. So everyone gets a fresh start.
Mm.
But does this approach actually work? Is it actually making a difference in youth crime rates?
Now, this is where things get really interesting. Mr. Philiplick, in his video, he actually shares a statistic that since they introduced the YCJA, back in 2003, youth crime rates have actually gone down.
Okay, so that's promising, right? But is that the only way to measure success? Like if the crime rates are lower? What do you think? And listeners, what do you guys think?
That's a really great question. And we're definitely going to unpack that more. But first, I want to kind of switch gears a bit and talk about, what about everyday citizens? Like, how do we play into all of this? You had that interesting story in your textbook, somebody who'd actually served on a jury, right?
Oh, yeah. It was a really powerful account of how it feels to actually be part of that decision-making process, deciding somebody's future. And it really highlighted how juries give ordinary people a direct say in how justice works.
Exactly. And then you also have these advocacy groups that are working hard both inside and outside of the system, pushing for more fairness and equity, like the John Howard Society and the Elizabeth Fry Society.
Oh, yeah. Speaking of the John Howard Society, they had this statistic that really got me thinking. They said that every dollar you spend on preventing crime actually saves $7 or $20 that would have been spent dealing with the crime itself.
Yeah. So it makes you wonder, right? Like, should we, as a society, should we be doing more to stop crime before it even starts? With young people especially.
Totally. Food for thought for everyone listening. Now, we can't talk about justice in Canada without talking about Indigenous perspectives, right?
Absolutely right. And you have some really interesting points in your sources about this. So first, let's talk about sentencing circles.
Yeah, sentencing circles. They're a totally different way of thinking about justice.
They are. It's this Indigenous tradition where elders and community members, they get to decide how to deal with somebody who has committed a crime, an offense. And it's really focused on healing and making things right, restoring peace in the community. Really different from just punishing someone.
Yeah, it's like understanding why somebody did something and helping them find a better path. But then Mr. Phillip has this really disturbing statistic that he shares. He says that Indigenous youth make up something like 50% of all the kids in custody. even though they're only 8% of the youth population.
Right, a real problem. And your notes talk about this thing called the cultural conflict theory, and it basically says that when different cultures clash, when they have different norms, it can lead to misunderstandings and bias, especially when it comes to something like the justice system.
Are you saying that the Canadian justice system, which is based on Western ideas, is biased against Indigenous youth because of cultural differences?
It's something to consider. And it brings up a huge question for all of us, right? How can Canada's justice system work better for Indigenous youth? Respect their culture. What do you think?
It's complicated for sure, and I don't think there are any easy answers. But we do need to keep asking these questions,
Yeah.
and we need to be aware of these disparities. Okay, so speaking of different perspectives, can we talk about the media? I mean, how does the media play into all of this?
Absolutely. The way they show youth crime, in the news and online, it can shape how people see the entire justice system. And it can even change people's opinions about how we should treat young people who've done something wrong. Mr. Philiblick has this really powerful cartoon. It shows Lady Justice, blindfolded. But she also has a seeing eye dog, and the dog is labeled racial bias.
Wow, that's striking. It makes you think, even though justice is supposed to be blind, there might still be these unconscious biases that affect how things work.
Exactly. So it's so important to be critical about what you see in the news, especially about crime and justice. Ask yourself, is this a balanced view? Is this a fair portrayal?
Yeah, a really powerful image for sure. But going back to that thing about crime rates and how the YCJA, how we measure if it's working or not, I think that leads to another interesting question, right? What does success actually look like when it comes to youth justice? Is it all about lower crime rates?
Yeah, that's a good point. If the goal is to rehabilitate kids, give them a chance to actually turn their lives around, shouldn't we also be looking at, things like how many of them end up committing more crimes,
Hmm.
like later in life?
Reoffending rates.
Exactly. And I think we also need to think about, like, what about the victims? Has the YCJA made things better or worse for them?
Yeah, I'd like to unpack there.
For sure. And what about those advocacy groups, like the John Howard Society? Are they actually having an impact? I mean, they're doing great work, but do you think it's actually changing the system?
Yeah, it's hard to measure, concretely, but I think they definitely play a really important role in pushing for change. They raise awareness about important issues, provide support for people who need it, and they advocate for policy reforms.
So they're kind of like watchdogs, right? Keeping
Mhm.
an eye on the system, making sure that it's actually fair for everyone. Like they're speaking up for those who can't speak up for themselves. That's a great way to put it. And it's not just organizations, individuals can contribute too
Yeah.
by staying informed, talking about these things, having conversations, and holding our elected officials accountable.
Right. It's not just about the laws, it's about how we as citizens, how we participate, and how we shape those conversations. Going back to Indigenous youth and the overrepresentation in the justice system, I mean, that statistic about 50% of kids in custody
Hmm.
being Indigenous it's just crazy, right?
Yeah, it really is. And it goes back to that idea of equity versus equality.
Yeah.
If the system was really fair and equitable, we wouldn't see those kinds of numbers, those disparities.
Yeah, it's like there's a disconnect somewhere. I mean, the YCJ is supposed to be about rehabilitation, considering each person's circumstances. But then you have these statistics, and it's like, what's going on?
Yeah, and that suggests that there are things going on, like systemic factors that are beyond just the laws themselves. We have to consider things like poverty, lack of resources, lack of opportunity, historical trauma that has really affected Indigenous communities disproportionately. And those things might lead to higher crime rates, but they also play a role in how Indigenous youth are treated by the justice system.
So it's not just about the laws. It's about all these other factors, the whole social context.
Exactly. It's like a puzzle where all the pieces are connected.
Yeah.
And to solve that puzzle, we need to come at it from all sides. Legal reforms are important, but we also need to address all of those underlying social and economic inequalities that put Indigenous youth at a disadvantage.
And I guess those cultural differences that we talked about earlier, they play a part too, right?
For sure. We need a system that's culturally sensitive, right?
Right.
That understands and respects those differences, and that responds to the needs of Indigenous communities in a way that's actually meaningful.
So we've talked about how the YCJA is trying to be fair and equitable, right?
Hmm.
But have there been any criticisms of it? No law is perfect, so are there problems with it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some people say that it's too lenient, that it's not tough enough on young offenders, that it doesn't do enough to think about, What about the victims? What about their rights?
So they want harsher punishments, a tougher approach.
Exactly. They think we need to be tougher, send a stronger message that what you do has consequences.
And then on the flip side, you have people who argue that the YCJA doesn't do enough to address those root causes that lead to crime, right? Like poverty, lack of opportunity.
Yeah, that's right. They argue that those things, poverty and mental health, they're all underlying drivers of why crime happens. And just focusing on punishment won't solve those problems.
So they're saying we should focus more on prevention and on those bigger social problems.
Exactly. They're looking at the big picture.
It's like, how do you balance those two things? Holding young people accountable, but also understanding the factors that might have led them to do something wrong.
That's a really tough question, like walking a tightrope.
It is.
It's a question that policymakers and judges and even everyday citizens are struggling with. So you mentioned that John Howard's statistic about cost savings really stood out to you. What was it about that resonated with you?
I think for me, it's the idea that, if we put money into prevention programs, we could actually reduce crime and save money in the long run.
It's a smart approach, right?
Yeah.
And a compassionate one, too.
Yeah, totally agree. It's about shifting our mindset from just reacting to crime to actually trying to stop it from happening in the first place. But of course, it raises more questions, right? What kinds of prevention programs work best? And how do we make sure those programs are available to the communities that really need them the most?
So many good questions. It's like we're peeling back layers of an onion, and each layer has more complexities to uncover. Exactly. And that's the beauty of these deep dives. We're not just skimming the surface. We're really trying to understand these issues, the nuances, all those different perspectives. Now, you had a lot of really interesting notes about sentencing circles, right? And how they're different from that Western-style adversarial justice system.
Yeah. I was really fascinated by the whole idea of the community being involved and how elders guide the process. It's a lot more holistic than just our usual court system, right?
Yeah.
It considers everyone, not just the person who did something wrong.
Absolutely. It's about repairing harm, right? Making things right, restoring balance to the community. And it's a great example of how we can learn from Indigenous knowledge and traditions about different ways to think about justice.
It also makes me think about, our court system is very adversarial, right? It's like two sides fighting. And sentencing circles are more collaborative. So it makes me wonder, is there a way to bring some of those Indigenous principles into our regular justice system?
That's really interesting. Like, could we make it less about winning and losing and more about finding solutions that help everybody? Solutions that help people heal and understand each other better.
Now, that would be a huge change.
Yeah.
But I don't know, it seems hard to imagine how that would happen because our adversarial system is so, it's just so ingrained in our whole legal tradition.
Yeah, definitely a big challenge, but not necessarily impossible. There are actually some programs out there that are experimenting with restorative justice practices, so there's hope, right? Hope for real progress.
That's good to hear, like a little glimmer of light.
Exactly, and it's those little glimmers of hope that keep us going and inspire us to keep pushing for a better future for all young people.
Well said. So we've talked a lot about the laws and stuff, but I think it's important to also talk about the emotional side of things, right? What about the impact of all this on young people's mental health?
Yeah, that's such a critical point. It's got to be incredibly stressful for a young person to go through the justice system, even if the outcome is good, they're probably dealing with a lot of shame, guilt, anxiety, uncertainty about what's going to happen, and they might be having problems at home, at school, with friends.
So we need to make sure that the justice system actually helps them, right? With access to mental health support, counseling, those kinds of things.
For sure. Taking care of their mental and emotional well-being is essential for rehabilitation.
And it's not just about therapy. It's about creating a system that understands trauma, a system that is sensitive to what they've been through, especially kids who have experienced really difficult things in their lives.
I agree. We need a system that is compassionate, a system that understands, that focuses on helping young people to heal and to grow.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so what happens after they've completed their sentence? Are there supports in place to help them get back on their feet, reintegrate into society?
Yeah, there are. There are a lot of organizations that help young people as they're transitioning back into the community. Things like housing, job training, getting back into school, mentorship.
This is helping them, giving them the tools to build a new life.
Yeah, giving them a hand up. And these programs, they can be really important in reducing the chances of them ending up back in the system and helping them become productive members of society.
So justice doesn't just end when the sentence is over. It's about what comes after, too, right? providing the support they need to succeed.
Exactly. Now, your notes had this thing about youth-led initiatives. What do you think about that? Like young people actually being involved in shaping the justice system.
I think it's awesome. It's about empowering them to be part of the solution, to actually have a voice in the systems that affect them.
Right. Like they're saying, hey, we're not just the subjects of the justice system, we're actually part of making it better.
I love that. It's about realizing that they have power,
Mm-hmm.
that they can create change.
And recognizing their potential, right? That they have so much to contribute.
And that the system should be listening to them and responding to their needs and what they want.
Absolutely. So, big question. What do you think the future of youth justice in Canada should look like? What are you hoping for?
Wow, big question. I guess I hope that we can move towards a system that's truly equitable, compassionate, a system that really focuses on rehabilitation.
That's great. How about you? What are your hopes?
Well, I hope that we can continue to learn from Indigenous ways of doing things, like those sentencing circles, and maybe find ways to use those ideas that focus on healing and restoration in our regular courts.
I like that. I share that hope.
Yeah. And I also hope that we'll keep putting money into prevention programs, right? And address things like poverty and lack of opportunity, all those things that can contribute to crime in the first place.
Yeah, really getting to the root of the problem, not just dealing with the symptoms.
And I guess I hope that we can create a justice system that understands trauma, that's sensitive to the needs of young people, especially those who have gone through difficult experiences.
That's so important. It's about realizing that justice doesn't have to be all about punishment. It can be about healing, transformation,
Yeah.
empowerment.
Yeah. Love that. Now, I'm curious about something we haven't talked about. Technology. What about technology? How does technology play a role in all of this?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Technology, it's playing a bigger and bigger role, right? Both in how crimes are committed and how the justice system responds.
Right, like cyberbullying. Online exploitation, that's a whole new area.
It is, and the justice system is still trying to figure out how to deal with all these new challenges.
And things like electronic monitoring, like those ankle bracelets.
Yeah.
They're using those more and more to track young offenders. It feels like technology is changing how we even think about justice.
It is changing things, for sure. And it raises a lot of ethical questions, too, right? Privacy, surveillance, bias.
Right, like a whole new frontier that we have to navigate really carefully.
Yeah, and we need to make sure that technology is used ethically, that we're thinking about the consequences. And we need to make sure it's actually making things more just, not less.
So we've talked about the police, the courts, the lawyers. What about parents? What about families? What role do they play in all of this?
Oh, yeah, that's such a key part that we haven't really dug into yet. Families are so important in a young person's life, and they can really make a difference in whether a kid goes down a good path or a bad path.
Like they say, it takes a village to raise a child.
Exactly. And when it comes to preventing youth crime, that village, it needs to be strong and supportive.
So what can parents do? What can families do to help their kids stay away from crime?
Well, a lot, right? Like providing a loving and stable home, setting clear boundaries and expectations, talking to them, being involved in their lives.
So it's about making sure they feel safe, loved, supported, connected.
Absolutely. And it's about teaching them the skills they need to make good decisions, to resolve conflicts peacefully, to cope with challenges in a healthy way.
It's not just about, like, being strict or punishing them. It's about guiding them, supporting them, and loving them unconditionally.
Exactly. Now, one thing your sources talked about that I thought was really interesting was early intervention. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's about recognizing that there are signs, right? Risk factors that can tell us if a kid is going down the wrong path. And if we can catch those signs early, we can step in, give them the support they need to turn things around.
That's right. And there are all kinds of early intervention programs, mentoring, counseling, family support, after-school programs, all sorts of things.
It's like making sure they don't fall through the cracks.
Exactly. And research shows that those programs can be really effective, not just in preventing crime, but in helping kids develop in a positive way.
So it's about being proactive.
Right.
I mean, not just waiting for something bad to happen.
Totally. Now, we've been talking a lot about how the YCJA tries to be fair to the young people who've committed offenses, right? But what about the victims? We haven't really talked about their perspective.
That's true. We've been so focused on the offenders that I think we've kind of forgotten about the people who were harmed by their actions.
Right. And it's so important to remember that they have needs and rights, too.
So what does justice look like from the victim's point of view?
Well, it can look like different things, right? Like sometimes it might involve something called restitution. That's where the person who committed the offense has to actually make amends for the harm they caused. Or sometimes it involves restorative justice practices like victim offender mediation, where the victim and the offender actually get to meet and talk about what happened, how it affected them.
So it's about giving them a voice
Mm-hmm.
and helping them to heal, to move on.
Exactly. And it's about making sure that the offender understands the consequences of what they did, that they take responsibility.
It's complicated. So many different things to think about.
Yeah, there's no easy answer. But by talking about it, by thinking about all the sides, we can hopefully move toward a system that is more just and fair for everybody.
For sure. Now, I'm curious about something. We've talked about all these different approaches, right? But how do we even know if they're working? What kind of evidence do we have?
Oh, good question. And that's something that researchers and policymakers are always trying to figure out.
It's not as simple as just looking at crime rates, right?
Nope. We need to look at a whole bunch of things, like how many people reoffend, the impact on victims, how much these programs cost, what it's like for young people going through the system.
It's a lot to analyze.
Yep.
A lot of different factors to consider.
It is, and there's no one solution that fits every situation. What works in one place might not work somewhere else.
So we need to be flexible, open to new ideas.
Totally. Now, we've talked a lot about the problems and the challenges, but honestly, I'm also really impressed by the people who work in youth justice. Like, they really care.
Yeah, totally. Reading all these sources, you can tell that the judges, the lawyers, the social workers, all of them, they're really committed to helping young people.
They're working hard to make things better, and it's inspiring.
Like, they can see a better future.
Yeah, a vision of a future where young people can thrive.
And they're working toward that vision, even when it's hard.
Exactly. So, big question. Out of everything we've talked about, what do you think is the most important thing for people to remember?
I think the most important thing is to remember that youth justice isn't just about punishment. It's about giving young people opportunities, remembering that they're still learning and growing, and that they deserve support. They deserve guidance.
Love that. It's about seeing them for their potential, not just their mistakes.
Exactly. And believing in them, believing that they can change and grow.
Right. And it's about building a system that helps them do that instead of holding them back.
Now, you mentioned that cartoon with Lady Justice and the seeing eye dog, the one about racial bias, that it really stood out to you. What was it about that image that was so powerful for you?
I think it was just how well it showed how sneaky bias can be. You know, it can be there even when we don't realize it, even when we think we're being fair. It reminds us that we all have biases and we have to constantly work to challenge them and make sure they're not affecting how we treat people or make decisions.
Like we have to keep checking ourselves, right?
Right.
Questioning our assumptions, making sure we're seeing things clearly.
Especially when it comes to the justice system, because the stakes are so high. Now, you had a lot of interesting stuff in your notes about the different things that citizens can do, how we can all get involved. What do you think is the most impactful way for people to make a difference?
I think it's about staying informed, staying engaged, learning about the issues, talking to people about it, and speaking up for change. Realizing that we all have a responsibility to work toward a more just and fair society.
Totally agree. Being active, not just sitting back and watching.
And realizing that even small things can make a difference, right? Like volunteering for a good cause, donating to an organization that's doing important work, or even just having a conversation with someone who sees things differently.
It all adds up. It's about creating a wave of change, and it starts with each of us.
Now, we talked about accountability and rehabilitation, but what about forgiveness? Is there even room for forgiveness in this whole thing, in the youth justice system? And if so, like, how does it fit in?
That is a deep question. Forgiveness is really personal, right? It's not something you can force on someone, but I do think it's important, especially when we're talking about young people.
Yeah, it feels like it could be a powerful way to heal for both the victim and the person who committed the offense.
It can be, but we have to remember, forgiving someone doesn't mean you're saying what they did was okay. It's about recognizing that they did something wrong, holding them accountable, but then choosing to let go of the anger and resentment.
It's a journey, not just a one-time thing, right?
Right. And it can take time and effort and a lot of emotional energy. But I think it's worth it. It can lead to real healing, real change.
Now, you mentioned how much you liked Mr. Fliplik's use of visual metaphors. What other images or metaphors come to mind for you when you think about all this, about youth justice?
A garden. I think of a garden. where young people are like seedlings, you know, full of potential but fragile.
I love that.
And the justice system is like the gardener, right? Taking
Mhm.
care of those seedlings, making sure they have what they need to grow.
And sometimes those seedlings need a little extra attention, maybe some pruning, maybe
Yeah.
some weeding to help them reach their full potential.
Exactly.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the biggest takeaway? What do you really hope our listeners will remember?
I think the most important thing is that youth justice isn't just about punishing kids, it's about giving them chances. It's about understanding that they're still growing up, that they can change, and that they deserve our help.
I like that a lot. It's about seeing what they can be, not just what they've done.
Yes. And building a system that helps them be their best selves.
It really is all about helping them reach their full potential. Now, you mentioned that you're particularly moved by the story in the textbook about someone's experience serving on a jury. What was it about that story that resonated with you so deeply?
It was how they talked about that weight of responsibility, knowing that their decision would have a real impact on another person's life. It just reminded me that the justice system, it's not just about abstract ideas, it's about people, real people with real stories and real consequences.
Absolutely. It's easy to forget that sometimes when you're talking about laws and policies and all that.
It is. And it also got me thinking about, how do we make sure that juries are actually fair? That they represent the community, that they can be impartial? Like, how do we even choose jurors in a way that's truly fair and unbiased?
Yeah, that's a good question. Makes me wonder if there are ways to improve the selection process, like maybe reaching out to more diverse communities,
Hmm.
or having some kind of training program to help potential jurors recognize and deal with their own biases.
That's a great idea. It's about making sure that everyone feels included, that everyone has a chance to participate, and that their voice matters. Now, we've talked a lot about the adults in the system, but what about the young people themselves? Should they have a say in how it all works?
That's such an interesting question. It makes me think about those youth-led initiatives we were talking about earlier. I mean, they're the ones who are actually going through the system, so they must have some valuable insights, right? They should be able to share their experiences and ideas for how to make things better.
Absolutely. They're the ones most affected by the justice system, so their voices need to be heard.
It's about recognizing that they're not just passive recipients of whatever happens to them. They can be agents of change.
So going back to those cost savings from crime prevention that the John Howard Society mentioned, what kind of programs are actually working? What are some of the most effective ways to prevent youth crime in the first place?
Well, there's a lot of research being done on this, and some of the most promising things they're finding are early childhood education programs, family support services, mentoring programs, and after-school activities that give kids positive things to do instead of getting into trouble.
So it's about investing in kids early on, giving them a good foundation, creating opportunities for them to succeed.
Exactly. And it's also about addressing those underlying social and economic problems we've talked about, like
Yeah.
poverty, lack of education, exposure to violence, all those things that can make it harder for kids to make good choices. It's about creating a society where all young people have a chance to thrive, no matter what their background is.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about rehabilitation being the goal, but what does that actually look like? What kind of programs and services are out there to help young people turn their lives around?
Well, there's a whole range of programs, and it really depends on what each individual needs. It could be things like counseling, educational programs, job training, substance abuse treatment,
Yeah.
anger management.
So it's about figuring out what led them to do those things in the first place, and then giving them the tools they need to make better choices.
Exactly, and helping them learn those important life skills,
Hmm.
like how to communicate, how to solve problems, how to make good decisions. Those are things that will help them throughout their lives, not just in the justice system.
It's about giving them a chance to be their best selves. Now, you mentioned the YCJA's emphasis on protecting the identities of young offenders. What are the arguments for and against that? I mean, some people might say that if you commit a crime, you should have to face the consequences publicly, right? Yeah, some people feel that way, and there's definitely a debate about whether it actually helps young people in the long run. Some argue that it lets them avoid taking responsibility for what they did.
Like they're getting off easy.
Yeah, kind of. But the other side of that is there's research that shows that if you protect their identities, it reduces the stigma of having a criminal record. which can make it a lot easier for them to find jobs, get into school, and just build a good life.
It's like giving them a chance to start over without being judged for their past.
Exactly. And in the end, the goal is to help them become productive members of society, right? So the question is, which approach is actually going to work better?
That's a really good point. It's not just about punishment. It's about what's best for them and for society as a whole in the long run. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on something we haven't really discussed. Mercy. Is there even a place for mercy in a system that's all about the law and holding people accountable?
Wow, that's a tough one. People have been debating that for ages. Mercy is hard to define, hard to measure. But personally, I think it does have a role, especially when we're talking about young people.
Yeah, it feels like it could be really important, both for the victim and the offender, like a way to heal and move forward.
It definitely can be. But it's not about saying that what they did was okay. It's about acknowledging the harm, holding them accountable, but then choosing to let go of the anger.
So it's not just a one-time thing, it's a process.
Exactly. And it takes work, it takes time, it takes a lot of emotional energy. But I think it can be incredibly powerful and lead to real healing and change.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a really eye-opening conversation, and I hope our listeners have learned a lot and had some things to think about.
It's been my pleasure, and I hope everyone listening will keep learning, keep questioning, and keep talking about these important issues, because creating a more just and equitable society is something we all need to work on together.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep working towards a better world for everyone.